Lena had learned to be invisible. Not the dramatic kind of invisible. Not the kind you read about in stories where someone feels overlooked and misunderstood and special in their suffering. The ordinary kind. The practical kind. The kind you develop when you grow up in a house where being noticed usually meant being given something else to carry. She was good at it. She moved through rooms without disturbing them. She spoke when spoken to, and not much beyond that. She had a particular way of entering a space that took up the minimum amount of it, shoulders slightly inward, steps quiet, presence dialed down to something easily ignored. This had served her well for 23 years. It was serving her considerably less well right now, standing in the middle of a forest in the dark, with rain coming down hard enough to turn the path beneath her feet into something closer to a river, trying to find her way back to the village before the last of the light disappeared entirely. She had been collecting herbs. This was, in retrospect, an activity best completed before the sky turned the particular shade of gray that meant the kind of rain that did not care about your plans. She had noticed the sky. She had thought, I should go back. She had found 3 more plants she needed and kept going. She was also very bad at leaving things unfinished. The lantern she had brought was useless now. The wind had killed it twice, and she had given up on the 3rd attempt. She knew these woods reasonably well, had been coming here since she was a child, following her grandmother's instructions about which plants were useful and which ones would make you deeply regret your choices. But knowing a forest in daylight and knowing it in a rainstorm at dusk were different kinds of knowledge. She pulled her cloak tighter. The basket of herbs was going to be largely ruined if she did not get them under cover soon, which meant this entire evening had been a waste, which was exactly the kind of thing she did not need on top of everything else the last several months had already been. She did not think about the last several months. She kept walking. The sound she heard next stopped her completely. Not the rain, not the wind in the trees, something underneath those things, something that did not belong to the forest. She stood still and listened with the particular attention of someone who had grown up being told that the woods at night required your full respect. There it was again. A sound that was somewhere between a breath and something worse than a breath. She moved toward it before she had consciously decided to move toward it, which was the problem with her. She had always known it was the problem with her. She could not hear something suffering and walk the other way. It was a flaw her grandmother had called a gift, and her practical nature had always quietly disagreed. She pushed through the undergrowth to the left of the path. He was against the base of a large oak, which was providing approximately no shelter from the rain, but was at least something solid at his back. Large, that was the first thing she registered. Even slumped against a tree in the dark and the rain, he was visibly enormous, the kind of man who occupied space differently than ordinary people. Dark hair plastered flat against his face. One hand pressed to his side in the way that meant the thing underneath that hand was bad. She crouched down. His eyes were closed. She reached out and pressed 2 fingers to his neck the way her grandmother had taught her, not searching for a pulse the dramatic way people did in stories, but just placing her fingers and waiting. It was there, unsteady, but present. The wound at his side was worse up close. Something had caused it. She did not want to think too carefully about what, and it had been bleeding long enough that the rain and the blood had become difficult to separate. She looked at him for a moment. She looked back in the direction of the village, which was a considerable walk even in good weather. She looked at the wound. She made a decision. She could not move him. He was far too large, and she was built for endurance rather than strength. The village was too far. The wound needed attention that could not wait for a journey in the rain. She knew these woods. There was a shelter, not much of one, a woodcutter's hut that had not been used in several seasons, 15 minutes from here if she moved fast. Dry roof. fireplace that might still be functional. It was the best option she had, which was a low bar but still a bar. She needed to wake him enough to walk. She put her hand on his shoulder and pressed, firmly once. His eyes opened. The eyes that looked back at her were dark and unfocused, and in considerable pain. But they were alert in the way of someone whose alertness was a reflex too deep to be entirely shut off even by blood loss and rain, and whatever else had brought him to the base of this tree in the dark. She held his gaze. "There is a shelter," she said, clearly and close enough that he could hear her over the rain. 15 minutes from here. I cannot carry you. You need to walk. I will help you, but you need to walk. He looked at her for a moment with those unfocused dark eyes. Then, he nodded. It took him 3 attempts to get upright, and all of her weight braced against his side to keep him there once he managed it. He was so much larger than her that the geometry of supporting him was complicated, and she had to do considerable improvisation on the way. His arm over her shoulders, her arm around his waist, keeping careful distance from the wound. The two of them moving through the dark, wet forest at the pace of someone who was not going to make it much further than this, but was making it anyway through what appeared to be pure stubbornness. 15 minutes took 30. She got him through the door of the hut and to the floor by the fireplace, and he went down heavily, and she let him, because there was no dignified version of this, and dignity was not the priority. She found wood, dry enough, barely. She had flint in her herb basket because her grandmother had been a woman who believed in being prepared for the forest's particular sense of humor. It took 4 attempts in cold, wet fingers, and then the fire caught and she turned back to him. He was watching her. She pushed her wet hair out of her face. "Right," she said. "This is going to hurt." She had seen wounds before. Her grandmother had been the closest thing the village had to a healer for 30 years, and Lena had been her shadow from the age of 7 until the age of 19 when her grandmother had died and left her the cottage and the herb knowledge and the particular reputation of being the woman you went to when the official physician's methods were not working. She had seen bad wounds. This one was bad. She worked by firelight, her wet cloak discarded, her sleeves pushed up. She had her herb basket, diminished by the rain but not entirely useless, and the woodcutter's hut had yielded a cloth she had torn into strips and a small pot she could heat water in once the fire was established enough. He did not make much sound. This told her several things. It told her he was accustomed to pain in the way that people only become accustomed to pain through repeated experience. It told her he had the particular self-control of someone who had decided a long time ago that showing pain was not something he was going to do. And it told her the wound, while serious, had not hit anything immediately fatal, because a man with a perforated organ did not have the composure he was maintaining. She cleaned it. She packed it with what she had that would slow the bleeding and fight infection. She bound it tightly with the strips of cloth. He watched her the entire time, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, in the way of someone who was not used to being tended to and was finding the experience disorienting. She tied off the last bandage and sat back on her heels and looked at her work. "It will hold for tonight," she said. "Tomorrow we can get you to the village properly." He said nothing. She looked at him. He was looking at her face with an expression she could not read clearly in the firelight, something between assessment and something else she did not have an immediate name for. She became aware, in the way you become aware of things you have been not thinking about, that she did not know who he was. Which was unusual. She knew everyone within a day's travel of the village. That was simply the nature of being the person people came to when they were unwell. Faces and names and the particular histories of people's bodies were her professional landscape. She did not know this face. She knew the type of it. The severity of the bone structure, the particular way power arranged itself in a person's posture even when that person was currently on the floor of a woodcutter's hut with a serious wound and soaked through from rain. There were men who looked like authority the way some trees looked like they had been there before you arrived and would be there after you left. He looked like that. She kept her face neutral and her thoughts to herself because neither of those things were relevant to the wound. "You should sleep," she said. "The binding will hold, but you need to stay still." A pause. "You saved my life," he said. His voice was different from what she had expected. Not that she had expected anything in particular, just lower, rougher, with a quality of someone who chose words with some care. "You were not dead yet," she said practically. "I helped you not get there." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, adjacent to one. The fire was doing its work now, warmth beginning to compete with the wet cold they had both come in wearing. She moved to the other side of the small hut and wrung out her cloak as best she could and hung it near the fire and sat against the wall with her knees up. She could feel him watching her still. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lena," she said. "From the village to the east." He was quiet. She looked at the fire. "What is yours?" she asked, because it was the natural question and because something in her had already begun to think about tomorrow and what it might mean to know the answer. Another pause, longer than the first. "Caden," he said. Just that. No family name, no title, no the rest of it, which was either the habit of a private person or the habit of a person who expected their name to be sufficient on its own. She had heard that name. She had heard it in the context of exactly one thing, repeated in different forms over the last several months in the village with varying levels of accuracy and drama. The Alpha King of the Northern and Eastern Territories, young to hold that much. Ruthless, they said, though ruthless was a word people applied to anyone who made decisions they did not like. Powerful. Certainly, he had ended a territorial war in 18 months that people had been predicting would run for a decade, and he had, 3 months ago, rejected a mate. This was what the village had talked about most, because the village had an appetite for the personal lives of powerful people that outpaced their interest in wars or politics. He had rejected her, the girl he had been matched to. Had looked at her at the formal presentation, in front of his entire court, and refused the bond. Lena had heard this story. She had not thought about it much because she had other things to think about and other people's romantic decisions were not her area. She thought about it now. She kept her face on the fire. "Sleep," she said again. "I will keep watch." He looked at her for a long moment in the firelight. Then his eyes closed. She sat against the wall of the hut listening to the rain on the roof and the fire doing its quiet work and the slow steadying of his breathing, and she thought, with the part of her mind that was always practical, that tomorrow was going to be a complicated day. He woke before dawn. She knew because she had not slept much herself, the floor of a woodcutter's hut being what it was. And she had been watching the fire and listening to the rain ease off into something quieter, and she heard the change in his breathing before she heard him move. She looked over. He was looking at the ceiling with his eyes open, and the expression of someone taking inventory of the situation before committing to any reaction to it. "The wound," she said. "Do not move suddenly." He turned his head to look at her. She had the impression he was slightly surprised to find her still there, like he had expected her presence to be something he had dreamed. "You stayed," he said. "The wound needed monitoring," she said, "and I did not feel like walking back through the forest in the rain at midnight." He looked at her for a moment. "How is it?" he said. "The wound." She crossed to him and crouched and checked the binding without asking permission. The bleeding had stopped. The binding had held. The herbs had done what she had intended. "Better than it should be," she said honestly. "You lost considerable blood before I found you. You need rest and proper attention and food when you can manage it." His jaw tightened slightly. "I cannot stay here. She looked at him with the patience she used for patients who were making poor decisions. "You can walk to the village in an hour," she said, "if you go slowly and lean on me and do not do anything sudden. You cannot ride hard, or fight, or do whatever it was you were doing last night that produced this wound. That is weeks away at the earliest." He said nothing. She could see him calculating. "There are people looking for me," he said. She nodded. She had assumed as much. "Where were you coming from?" she asked. He looked at her in the way of someone deciding how much to say. "A meeting," he said. That did not conclude as planned. She understood this to mean something had gone wrong in a way that involved the wound, and she decided not to press the specifics. "Your people," she said. "They are searching for you now?" "Yes," she thought about this. "The village is small," she said. "If your people come looking, they will find you there. If you would rather not be found in a state that suggests you were in any difficulty, you have perhaps 2 days in my cottage before word travels that there is someone unusual among us." He looked at her steadily. "Why are you offering that?" he said. She sat back on her heels. "Because the alternative is you walking back into those woods in your current condition and finishing what started last night," she said. "And I spent considerable effort on that binding, and I would rather it not be wasted." He was quiet for a moment. "You do not know who I am," he said. It was not entirely a question. She held his gaze. "I have a reasonable idea," she said, "and you are still offering." "Yes," he looked at her with an expression she was finding difficult to categorize. Not suspicion, exactly. Something more like a man encountering a variable he had not planned for and was not sure what to do with. "All right," he said. Getting him to the village took the better part of the morning, slowly, the way she had said, his arm over her shoulders and her arm around his waist with careful distance from the wound. He was heavy in the way of someone who was mostly muscle and had not been eating lightly, and the path was still wet from the rain, and she had to redirect them twice when she heard other travelers on the main track. She did not think he had been in the habit of being redirected. He went where she steered him without comment, which told her his pain was worse than he was letting on. Her cottage was at the edge of the village, which was convenient now. She got him inside into the small room she used for patients and onto the proper bed, and he sat on the edge of it and breathed with controlled precision for a moment. She brought water. Clean bandages. The better version of what she had been working with in the hut. He watched her set things out. "You live alone," he said. "Yes," she said, "and you make a habit of bringing wounded strangers home from the forest." "Only the ones who will not make it otherwise," she said. She began unwrapping the hut binding to replace it with something cleaner, and he was still and quiet while she worked, which she appreciated. Some patients needed to talk through the discomfort. Some needed to prove they were not feeling it. He simply existed with it, which was easier. She was nearly done with the new binding when he said, quietly, "I will not put you in danger by being here." She tied off the bandage. "My patients put me in danger occasionally," she said. "It is part of the work. This is different." She looked up at him. He was looking at her seriously with those dark eyes, and there was something in his face that was trying to communicate something she was choosing not to receive yet. "Rest first," she said. "Different later." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he lay down. She pulled the curtain across the doorway and went to her kitchen and put the kettle on, and stood at her window looking out at the village going about its morning, and thought about what she had brought home from the forest. By the second day he was sitting up. By the third he was at the table in her kitchen, which she had not exactly invited him to, but which had happened through a gradual migration from the patient room to the doorway to the chair, each step presented as simply the next logical position rather than a request. She had noticed this about him. He did not ask for things directly. He moved toward them incrementally and waited to see if anyone stopped him. She did not stop him. The kitchen was warm, and he looked less gray in natural light, and she could monitor him better when he was in the same room. He watched her work. She made medicines in the mornings, when the light was good and the village was quiet. It required concentration, and he seemed to understand this without being told, staying silent while she measured and ground and combined things, only speaking in the spaces between tasks. He asked questions. When he did speak, not personal ones, practical ones. What was that plant? What did it do? Why that combination rather than another? She answered without looking up from her work, because the work required her eyes. He listened the way people listened when they were genuinely interested, rather than being polite. She could tell the difference. 23 years of people being polite while waiting for her to finish talking had given her a very accurate sense of it. By the 4th day, she had told him more about plant medicine than she had told anyone outside of the apprentice she had taken on briefly the previous year, who had ultimately decided the work was not for her. She noticed this afterward and was not entirely sure what to do with it. "Your people have not come," she said on the 4th evening. They were at the table, the simple dinner she had made between them. "No," he said. She looked at him. "They will have gone to the stronghold," he said. "They will assume I made my way back by another route." She nodded. "Is that what you want them to assume? For now?" She looked at her cup. "You are not going to tell me what happened in the forest," she said. "No." She had expected that. "There are people who would like to know where you are," she said. "Not your people. Other people." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She thought about this. "Then you should not be here too much longer," she said. A stranger in a village this size becomes a topic within a week, and a topic becomes information, and information travels. He was quiet. "I know," he said. "I am aware I have stayed longer than I should. The wound needs another week at minimum," she said, "before you can ride without reopening it." He nodded slowly. "I am putting you at risk," he said, "by being here. You are a patient," she said. "I do not turn patients away." He looked at her with that expression she was still working on categorizing, the one that appeared when she said something that seemed to catch him slightly off guard. "You are a very unusual person," he said. She raised her eyebrows slightly. "I am a village healer," she said. "I am the least unusual person I know." "That is not what I mean," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her in the firelight with something careful and direct in his face, the kind of look that had more behind it than was being said. She picked up her cup. "Sleep," she said. "The wound needs it." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he went. She sat at the table after he had gone and held her cup and thought about the particular texture of the last 4 days, which had been different from ordinary days in a way she had been carefully not examining. She was a practical person. She had always been practical. It was the quality she valued most in herself, because it had gotten her through things that sentiment alone would not have survived. She applied her practicality now. He was a patient who would leave when he was well enough. He was also, incidentally, the alpha king who had rejected a mate publicly 3 months ago. He was also a man who asked questions about plant medicine with genuine interest and listened to the answers, and had not once, in 4 days, treated her like someone below his notice. These were facts. She noted them. She went to bed and slept and did not think about the way he had looked at her across the dinner table. She was mostly successful. On the 6th day he helped her. She had not asked him to. She had gone out to the garden in the early morning to check on the herbs she had growing along the south wall, and when she came back inside, he was standing at the work table looking at the dried bundles hanging from the ceiling with an expression of focus. He pointed at one. "You use that for inflammation," he said. She set down her basket. "Yes," she said. "How do you know that?" "My grandmother," he said. She was not a healer, but she knew plants. Lena looked at him. He looked back at her with something slightly unguarded in his face, The way people looked when they had said something that came from a real place rather than a managed one. She told him what each bundle was. He remembered. She tested him an hour later without making a thing of it, pointing to different bundles and waiting, and he named them correctly in 9 out of 11 cases, which was better than her apprentice had managed after 2 weeks. She told him this. He looked briefly, genuinely pleased, which was a different expression from any she had seen on him, and it did something unexpected to her chest that she addressed by going to check on the fire. The village had begun to notice him. Not dramatically, just the way villages noticed things, gradually and then, all at once. The baker's wife had mentioned to Lena in passing that there was a man staying with her. Was he a relative? And Lena had said a patient, and the baker's wife had given her the particular look of a woman who was not convinced but was choosing not to press. Dort would have told her, a voice in her head said, which was an unhelpful observation. She put it away. He came with her on the 7th day to the forest edge to collect what she needed. She had not planned for this either. It had simply happened the way things with him seemed to happen, through incremental logical steps. He moved differently than she had expected from a man of his size. Quietly, he watched the forest with a quality of attention that was not the attention of someone afraid of it, but the attention of someone who understood it. He knew which plants to avoid touching. She asked him about it. The north, he said. There are plants in the northern territories that will kill you if you handle them incorrectly. You learn early. She nodded. They walked for a while in quiet that was not uncomfortable. She had a question she had been carrying for several days, and she set it down now because she was practical and carrying things without purpose was not her way. The rejection, she said, 3 months ago. He went still beside her. She kept walking at the same pace. It is public knowledge, she said. I am not asking you to explain yourself. I am asking because there was a girl involved, and the village had opinions about it, and I work from information rather than opinions where I can. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. She was not matched to me, he said finally. Lena glanced at him. The formal presentation was a political arrangement, he said. Her family's arrangement. She was not my mate. I could feel it clearly, and she could feel it clearly, and proceeding would have been a cruelty to both of us. Lena considered this. People said you were cold, she said. About it. That you rejected her publicly without care for what it cost her. His jaw tightened. I met with her privately first, he said. I told her what I intended to do and why, and I gave her every option I could. She agreed. The public presentation was her family's stage. The rejection was the only honest thing available to us both. Lena nodded slowly. She believed him. Not because he was who he was, or because she had been caring for him for a week, because she had been watching him for a week, and she had a well-developed sense for the shape of people's honesty. Did she find her actual mate? Lena asked. Yes, he said, several weeks later. She wrote to thank me. Lena looked at the path ahead. Then it cost something and was still right, she said. Those are the hardest ones. He looked at her. Yes, he said. They are. They walked back to the cottage in the same quiet. She processed what she had heard and set it alongside everything else she had accumulated in 7 days and noted that the picture was becoming clearer and that a clearer picture was not making things simpler. That evening, he sat across from her again at the kitchen table, and the firelight did what firelight does, and she kept her eyes on her cup and her thoughts to herself. He was leaving soon. She had known this from the first day. It was not a surprise. She noted that it felt like one anyway, and filed this under things to address when she had more time and better information. She found out on the 8th day. Not from him. From the miller's son, who had been to the market town 2 days east and had come back with news the way he always came back with news. At volume. In the middle of the square. The Alpha King, The miller's son said to anyone within earshot, which included Lena, who was buying vegetables and had gone very still, was ambushed 2 weeks ago near the Felrith border. His people have been searching for him. There is word he may not have survived. Lena paid for her vegetables. She walked back to the cottage at the same pace she always walked. She closed the door behind her. He was at the work table, looking at a document she had not known he had, some folded paper from his coat that had survived the rain better than most things. She set down her basket. "The miller's son came back from the market town," she said. He looked up. She told him what the miller's son had said. He was still for a moment. Then he folded the document. "My people need to know I am alive," he said. "I was trying to avoid drawing attention to your village, but I have taken too long." She nodded. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "If I send word," he said, "they will come here." "Yes, and that will draw exactly the kind of attention I was trying to avoid for you." She looked at him steadily. "I am a healer," she said. "It is not unusual for me to have patients who require discretion. I can manage the village's curiosity. Send word to your people." He held her gaze. She could see him working through it. The calculation she had watched him do with everything, the weighing of options and consequences, and the position of other people in the picture. "There is something else," he said. She waited. He set down the document and looked at the table for a moment, and then at her. "The ambush," he said, "was not random." She kept her face quiet. "Someone in my court," he said, "gave information about my route." She understood what this meant, not just that he had been ambushed, that he had been staying in her cottage for 8 days with a target on him that had not stopped existing. She sat down. "How much danger?" she said. "If they believe I am dead," he said, "less than if they know I am alive and recovering in a village healer's cottage." She thought about this with the practical part of her mind that was good in emergencies. Then, "Send word quietly," she said. "One trusted person only, someone who can come without drawing attention, and until they arrive, the miller's son's version is the truth as far as anyone here needs to know." He looked at her. "You are managing this very calmly," he said. She raised her eyebrows slightly. "I have had patience with complicated situations before," she said. "Not this complicated. Perhaps not," she said. "But the principle is the same. Keep them stable, keep them safe, get them through until things are better. That is the work." He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she had been accumulating over 8 days without knowing what to do with it. Something between careful and something else. Something she would have called it if she were less practical. She stood up. "Write to your person," she said. "I will go to the market tomorrow and find a courier who does not operate through the usual routes." He caught her wrist as she passed. She stopped. He released it immediately, not a grip, just a contact. A moment. She looked at his hand and then at his face. "Thank you," he said. And she could hear the weight in it, that it was not a courtesy but an actual thing. She nodded once and went to see about dinner. She stood at the fire and let the heat do something about the warmth that had settled in her wrist where his hand had been, and reminded herself with some firmness about practicality and the nature of this situation, and patients who were not patients forever. It helped less than she would have liked. The courier left the next morning. A woman who traveled between villages trading cloth, who owed Lena a favor from 2 winters ago involving a fever and a difficult birth, and the kind of night that created lasting obligations. She would carry the message to the nearest outpost of the Northern Guard and ask no questions and tell no one. 2 days, maybe 3, Lena had said, before anyone arrives. He had nodded. They had 2 days. She was not thinking about it in those terms. She was not thinking about it as 2 days of anything. She was thinking about the wound, which was healing well but needed the full course of treatment, and the patient who needed rest and food, and to stop reviewing that document with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a problem before reinforcements arrived. She told him this. He looked at her over the document. "I am resting," he said. "You are working," she said. "These are not mutually exclusive. For a man with a healing puncture wound they are," she said. He set the document down with the expression of someone doing her a favor. She went back to her medicines and he sat in the kitchen in what she supposed was his version of rest, which involved sitting very still and thinking visibly, and occasionally looking at her when he thought she was not paying attention. She was always paying attention. This was professionally unavoidable. On the second evening, when dinner was done and the fire was doing its evening work and the village had gone quiet outside, he said, "Tell me about your grandmother." She looked up from the book she was reading. He was watching her with that open quality he had developed over the last several days, the managed exterior wearing thinner as he felt better, as the pain receded and the cottage became familiar. "What do you want to know?" she said. "What she was like," he said. Lena thought about it honestly. "Practical," she said, "more practical than me, which is significant." She did not have much patience for feelings that couldn't be turned into something useful. But she was kind in the way that people are kind, when they genuinely believe other people matter, not as a performance. He listened. "She taught me everything," Lena continued. "Not just the plants. How to read a room, how to know what someone actually needed versus what they said they needed. How to be present with someone in a bad moment without making the moment about yourself. How to be invisible," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back steadily. She did not look away. "Is that what you see?" she said. "You make yourself small," he said. "Not because you are small. The opposite. You know exactly how much space you take up, and you have decided to take up less of it." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a very specific observation," she said. "You are a specific person," he said. She looked at the fire. "My grandmother said something similar once," she said. "She said I had learned to manage the inconvenience of myself." He said nothing, but she was talking to a woman who had never inconvenienced anyone in her life, Lena continued. "So I took it with some adjustment." "Lena," he said. She looked at him. He was leaning slightly forward, elbows on the table, and his face had the quality she had been learning to recognize as him saying something true rather than something managed. "You are not an inconvenience," he said. She held his gaze. The fire crackled. The cottage was very warm and very quiet. "I know that," she said, which was partly true and partly something she was in the process of knowing and had been since approximately the third day of him being at her kitchen table, asking questions about plant medicine with genuine attention. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at the fire. "There is something I should tell you," he said. She waited. "About why I am telling you that," he said. "About what these days have been. For me." She was very still. He looked at his hands on the table, which was the most uncertain she had ever seen him look, which was saying something because he did not do uncertain as a general practice. She did something she did not plan. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked at her hand. Then at her face. She held his gaze. She could feel his pulse under her fingers, not slow, not steady, the same thing that was happening in her own chest making itself known in him. She was a practical person. Practicality, she had just decided, had its limits. He turned his hand under hers. That was all. Just that, his hand turning so that her hand was in his rather than over it, his fingers closing carefully, not a grip, more like something being held that he was afraid of dropping. They stayed like that for a moment. Then, she said, "What were you going to tell me?" He looked at her. "That the mate bond," he said quietly, is not always immediate. Some people feel it the first moment. Some people feel it gradually, like something becoming clear that was always there. She was very still. I noticed it on the second day, he said, when I was well enough to notice anything at all. She looked at their hands. She had felt something, she thought. She had been naming it other things, noting it and setting it aside under more manageable labels. Concern for a patient, natural human warmth. The particular closeness that came from caring for someone through pain. She had been quite dedicated to the other labels. It terrified me, he said. To be honest, she looked at his face. She had not expected that word from him. I have been careful with this, he said. About not, he stopped, finding the right words, overwhelming you. The situation was already complicated. You were caring for me. I did not want to use that. She looked at him for a long moment. You have been here 9 days, she said slowly, and you have been carrying this for 7 of them. Yes, he said, and you chose not to say anything because you were worried about the power imbalance. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. She pressed her lips together for a moment. This is the most considerate thing anyone has ever done for me, she said, and also slightly maddening. His expression moved, something that was closer to a real smile than the adjacent to one she had seen on the second day. She looked at their hands again. I felt something, she said carefully. I was not calling it what it was. I am very good at not calling things what they are, when what they are is inconvenient. He waited. He was very good at waiting. This is inconvenient, she said. In the practical sense, you are who you are. I am a village healer. Your people are coming in a day, and then you will leave and go back to your court and your territory and your life, which is a very large and complicated life in which I am a person you found in a forest during an ambush. She could hear herself doing the thing she always did, building the practical wall, arranging the reasons. Lena, he said. She looked at him. I am not asking you to solve everything tonight, he said. I am telling you what is true so that you are not making decisions with incomplete information. She took a breath. What is true, she said. That I have not felt anything like this, he said. That I have spent 9 days in a cottage being tended by someone who treats me like a person with no interest in what I represent, and I cannot imagine going back to a life that doesn't have that in it. The fire crackled. The cottage held the warmth of the evening. She looked at him across the table with their hands still joined, and she thought about her grandmother saying, know what someone actually needs versus what they say they need. What she needed was to stop arranging reasons. She stood up from her chair and crossed around the table, and he turned in his chair to face her, and she sat on the edge of the table because it was there and they were suddenly close in a way that was not accidental. She looked at him from here. He looked back. His eyes were very dark and very careful, and under the careful was something she recognized because she had been feeling the same thing for days from the other side of it. She put her hand on the side of his face. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. I am not easy, she said. I have opinions, and I do not make myself small on demand, and I will argue with you about plant medicine at an unreasonable hour if I think I am right. Good, he said, which was so immediate she almost laughed. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. They stayed like that. The cottage quiet around them, the fire settling, the village asleep outside. She thought about the forest 10 days ago, and the figure against the tree in the rain, and the decision she had made because she could not hear something suffering, and walk the other way. She was glad she could not. His people came on the 3rd day, 3 of them, arriving at her cottage door in the early morning, with the careful presentation of people who had been told to be discreet and were doing their best. A woman named Sarah, who appeared to be some combination of guard and advisor, and had sharp eyes that took in the cottage, and Lena in one comprehensive sweep. 2 men who positioned themselves with the automatic efficiency of people who did this professionally. He met them at the door. Lena stayed in the kitchen and heard the low voices, not the words, and put water on for tea because something to do with her hands was useful. Sarah came into the kitchen. She stood in the doorway and looked at Lena with those sharp eyes. "You kept him alive," she said. "He was not particularly difficult to keep alive once he decided to cooperate," Lena said. Sarah made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "He has told me," Sarah said. "What you did, the forest, the hut." Lena nodded. "How bad was it?" Sarah asked. "When you found him?" "Bad enough," Lena said. "Another hour without attention, possibly less." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "He said you are a healer," she said. "Yes." "And you live here alone?" "Yes." Sarah looked at the kitchen, the bundles of herbs, the worktable, the 2 cups on the table. 2 cups, she noted, without expression. Lena looked at her steadily. Sarah looked back with the expression of a woman who had been in service to a powerful man for long enough to know the difference between what was said and what was true. She nodded once and went back to the corridor. He came into the kitchen later when his people had settled themselves and the morning was moving toward midday. He sat in his chair. She poured the tea and sat in hers. They looked at each other across the table. "When do you leave?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "if the wound continues as it is." She nodded. She had known this was tomorrow. She had been knowing it was tomorrow for 3 days. It did not help as much as knowing things usually did. "There are things to be addressed," he said. "At the court. The ambush. The person who provided information about my route." "I understand," she said. He was looking at her with something she was not managing as effectively as she had managed things at the beginning of this. "I do not want to leave," he said. She held his gaze. "But you will," she said, "because those things need addressing, and you are the person who addresses them." "Yes," she nodded. She looked at her tea. "Come back when you can," she said, "and let Sarah check the wound before you ride. And do not do anything in the next 2 weeks that opens it." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his without deciding to. "I will come back," he said. "That is not a vague intention. I will come back." She looked at him. She believed him. This was interesting because she was not a person who believed things without evidence, and she had known him for 10 days, which was not a significant evidence base, and yet she believed him. "You should know something," she said. He waited. 3 months ago, she said, when the village heard about the rejection. "I was one of the people who heard the story." He looked at her. "I thought," she said, "that it sounded cold." The way it was told. His jaw tightened slightly. "I know what you told me about it," she said quickly. "I am not saying that is what it was. I am saying that was my first impression. That a man had done a cold thing. He was still. And," she said, "when I found you in the forest, I did not know who you were at first, and then I had a reasonable idea, and I helped you anyway because you were bleeding and it was the right thing to do." "Yes," he said. "I want you to know," she said, "that what happened after that, the last 10 days, that was not me revising my impression because of who you are. It was me forming a new one from the actual evidence." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know that," he said. "I want to make sure," she said, "that you know I know the difference between you and what you represent." He stood up. He came around the table and she stood up, and he put his hand on the side of her face the way she had done to him 2 nights ago, and she leaned into it. "I know," he said. "That is." He stopped. "That is the most significant thing anyone has offered me in a long time." She put her hand over his. "Come back soon," she said. He pressed his forehead to hers. The kitchen was warm, and the tea was getting cold, and his people were somewhere in the cottage being professionally unaware of this, and she stood there and let herself be here completely without managing it into something smaller. It was terrifying. She did it anyway. He left at dawn. She was awake before him, which was not difficult because she had not slept much. She made breakfast with the automatic competence of someone who could do it without thinking, which was useful when thinking was occupied elsewhere. He came into the kitchen already dressed for travel, which made the whole thing suddenly and inconveniently real. She put food in front of him. He ate without ceremony. Sarah came in and reported something quietly, and he nodded and she left again, and Lena stood at the window with her cup and looked at the village waking up outside. He came to stand beside her. They looked out the window together. "The wound," she said. "Sarah has instructions." "I know," he said. "The stitching should not be removed for another 10 days. I know." "If it opens again, Lena," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with something direct and clear that cut through all of the clinical distance she had been trying to arrange herself behind. "I know," he said. "I will be careful. I will send word." She nodded. She looked back at the window. "You have made this harder," she said, "than I expected it to be." His hand found hers at her side. "Good," he said, and she could hear what he meant by it, the same thing she had meant when she had said it was terrifying and done it anyway. They stood at the window until Sarah appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who was sorry to interrupt and was doing so anyway. He squeezed her hand once. He walked to the door. She followed because the alternative was standing in the kitchen and she was not going to do that. Outside the morning was pale and cold and the horses were ready and his 2 men were mounted and Sarah was waiting with the patience of someone who had seen many leave-takings and was giving this one exactly the space it needed. He turned. She was on the step of the cottage. He was slightly below her, which put them at closer to the same height, and she looked at him in the early morning light and thought that 10 days was not very long, and also, with complete certainty, that it was enough to know what she knew. He leaned forward and pressed his mouth to her forehead, brief and deliberate. Then he stepped back. He mounted. She stood on the step with her hands folded and watched them go through the village and out the other side, and listened to the sound of hoofbeats until she could not hear them anymore. Then she went inside. Pip was not there to notice her face, which was good. Dort was not there, which was good. It was just her cottage and the 2 cups on the table, and the patient room with the bed that needed fresh linens, and the herbs on the work table, and all the ordinary pieces of her ordinary life arranged exactly as they had been before a rainstorm and a sound in the forest. She washed the cups. She changed the linens. She went to the work table and looked at the herbs and started her morning work. She was 3 tasks in before she realized she was naming them the way she had been naming them to him, quietly, to herself, explaining each one as she used it, as if he were standing beside her asking questions. She set down what she was holding. She stood at the work table for a moment. She was in a very significant amount of trouble, she thought, and she was not going to do anything about it except wait and see, because he had said he was coming back and she had believed him, and belief without evidence was not her usual practice, but here she was. She picked up what she had set down. She kept working. At midday, the baker's wife came with a question about her youngest's cough, and Lena answered it and sent her away with something useful and noted that the village was returning to its ordinary shape around her. She returned to her work. She was at the table in the late afternoon, making notes when she heard hoofbeats on the village track and kept her eyes on her page with considerable discipline. The hoofbeats did not pass. They stopped at her gate. She put down her pen very carefully and stood up and went to the window. He was there. Just him, not Sarah, not the 2 men. Just him on a dark horse at her gate, with the expression of someone who had ridden out of the village at dawn and come back before midday and was not sorry about it. She opened the door. He looked at her from the gate. "I told Sarah," he said, "that I had forgotten something." She folded her arms. "Had you?" she said. "Yes," he said. "What?" she said. He dismounted. He came through the gate. He stopped in front of her on the step. "This," he said, and kissed her, properly this time, both hands on her face, entirely without the careful management of everything that had been preceding this for 10 days. She put her hands in his coat and kissed him back. When they separated, she had her forehead on his chin, and his arms were around her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed saying. "I have a court to return to," he said into her hair. "I know," she said, "and a traitor to find. I know." And considerable political difficulty. She pulled back enough to look at him. "I know all of that," she said. "Come back when you can. I will be here." He looked at her. "You will," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her again, briefer this time. Then he went back through the gate and mounted and rode. She stood on the step until he was gone. Then she went inside and sat at her table and picked up her pen and put it down again and pressed both hands over her face and stayed like that for a while. He sent word on the 3rd day. A letter, brief, his handwriting which she recognized from the document she had seen him reviewing in the cottage. The situation at court was complicated. The matter was being addressed. He was well. The wound was holding. At the bottom, in handwriting that was slightly different from the rest, like it had been added after, he had written, "The Northern Territories have no one who knows what the Felrath root does." "I find this unacceptable." She read this 3 times. Then she folded the letter and put it in the drawer of her worktable and went back to her morning work with something warm sitting in her chest that she did not try to label as anything other than what it was. She wrote back that evening. She kept it practical, because she was practical. The wound care reminders, the specific signs that would mean the infection had returned, the timeline for the stitching. At the bottom, matching his tone precisely, she wrote, "The village has no one who can identify a northern survey map with any accuracy. I find this equally unacceptable." She sent it with the cloth trader the next morning. The days found their shape again. She worked. She tended her patients. She helped in the village in the ways she had always helped. Pip, who did not exist in this story, but whom she thought about in the abstract as the category of person who would find all of this enormously satisfying, would have been smug about it. A letter came every 4 days. Each one was primarily practical and contained one line at the end that was not. She replied in kind. On the 14th day he wrote, "The traitor has been identified. It is concluded. I will explain when I see you." She wrote back, "Good. When is when?" He wrote back, 2 days later, soon. She wrote, "That is not a date." He wrote, "I am aware." She wrote, "I have patients who use that word when they mean never." He wrote, the next day, in a letter that was shorter than the others, "I do not mean never. I mean that I am trying to arrange things so that when I come I can stay longer than a morning." She read this several times. She wrote back, "Take the time you need. I am not going anywhere." He did not write for 5 days after that, which was longer than the usual interval, and which she told herself meant he was occupied with the arranging rather than the alternative, and mostly believed it. On the 6th day, Sarah arrived. Alone, on a single horse, at her gate, in the late morning. She knocked, and when Lena opened the door she looked at Lena with those sharp eyes. "He sent me," Sarah said, with questions. "On his behalf." Lena looked at her. "He sent you to ask me something rather than asking himself." "Yes," he said, Sarah added, with the expression of someone delivering a message they find slightly baffling, that he did not want to ask it in a letter. Lena stepped back and let her in. She made tea. It seemed the appropriate response. Sarah sat at the table with her cup and looked around the cottage with those eyes that catalogued everything. "You know what I am here to ask," Sarah said. "I have an idea," Lena said. "He is not a simple man to be with," Sarah said. "I want to be honest with you about that. He is complicated in the way that people who carry a great deal of responsibility are complicated. He is not always easy. He works too much. He forgets that other people are tired when he is not tired. Lena looked at her cup. But, Sarah continued, he is loyal, deeply loyal. And he is honest, and in 10 years of service I have not seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you when I came to this cottage. Lena was quiet. What is the question? She said. Sarah told her. It was, as she had expected, not a small question. It was the kind of question that was actually several questions wearing one question's coat. Whether she could leave the village, whether she was willing to come into his world rather than him coming into hers. Whether she understood what that meant, the court, the politics, the public life that came with being beside a man like him. She sat with it. She thought about her grandmother and the cottage and the herbs and the life she had built here out of the things her grandmother had left her. She thought about 10 days and a letter every 4 days and one line at the end of each letter that was not practical. She thought about what she had said to him. I work from information rather than opinions where I can. She had the information. Yes, she told Sarah. Tell him yes. Sarah looked at her. To all of it, Sarah said. To all of it, Lena said. Sarah nodded. She finished her tea. She stood up and looked at Lena one more time with those comprehensive eyes. Good, she said. He will be here in 3 days. She left. Lena sat at the table alone in the warm cottage and looked at the worktable and the herbs and the drawer that had letters in it, and the 2 cups that had been on this table since the day she had made tea for people arriving, and never fully taken them away. 3 days, she thought. She went to go check on what she would need to bring from the garden before the season changed. He arrived on a clear morning, 3 days later, which was exactly what he had said. She had noted, over 10 days and 20-some letters, that he said what he meant. This was such a specific relief that she had not let herself think about it too directly until now. Standing at her gate watching him come down the village track on the dark horse, without the guard this time, without Sarah, just him. He dismounted at the gate. She was standing on the step. They looked at each other in the morning light. You came, she said, which was not what she had planned to say but came out anyway. I said I would, he said. She nodded. He came through the gate. He stopped in front of her, and she looked at him properly, the face she had memorized by firelight in a woodcutter's hut now, in clear autumn morning light. The wound had healed well, she could tell by the way he moved. He looked less tired than the last time, less worn by crisis, though not uncomplicated. She reached up and put her hand on his jaw the way she had on the 9th night. He leaned into it. How is the wound? She said. He made a sound. Properly, she said. It is healed, he said. Sarah had the stitching removed 4 days ago. I have done nothing to reopen it. She nodded. Good, she said. She dropped her hand and he caught it before it reached her side and held it. Sarah told me, he said, what you said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. All of it, he said. Yes, she said again. He was looking at her with the unguarded quality that had taken days to emerge from behind the managed exterior, and was now simply how he looked at her. I want you to know, he said, what I am asking, not just what it sounds like. I am asking you to come into something complicated. The court is not easy, and the politics are not simple, and there are people who will have opinions about where you come from and what you are, and I will not pretend otherwise. I know, she said, and I am asking you anyway. He said, I know that too, she said. He looked at her. Why, he said, and she could hear in it that he meant it seriously, that he actually wanted to know her reason rather than simply her answer. She thought about it honestly. Because, she said, you came back that morning. When you had already left, and you had every reason to simply send a letter, and instead, you came back, Because you have been sending me letters every 4 days for 5 weeks, and every single one of them has one line at the end that tells me something true. Because you asked Sarah to come ask me in person rather than in a letter, because you did not want to ask something that mattered in writing. She held his gaze. You are careful, she said. With things that matter to you, I have watched you be careful for 10 days and 5 weeks of letters, and that is the information I am working from. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled her forward and held her properly, and she let herself be held, which was still something she was getting used to. She had her face against his shoulder and his hand was in her hair, and the village was going about its mourning around them. There are things I would want to keep, she said into his coat. From here. My work. The ability to do it. Yes, he said. Immediately, it is not a small thing, she said, to uproot a life. I know, he said. We will do it carefully. She nodded. She pulled back enough to look at him. There is something you should know, she said. That I have been thinking about for a while. He waited. When I found you in the forest, she said. I had heard the story about the rejection 3 months ago, and I had a particular impression of you based on that story. Yes, he said. I want you to know, she said, that I fell in love with you in spite of that impression. Not because you explained yourself and I revised it, though that mattered, but because 10 days of evidence told me something different from one story, and I chose the evidence. He was looking at her very steadily. I am telling you, she said, because you should know that I see you. Not the Alpha King, not the rejection story, not the reputation. You. He put his hand on the side of her face. She leaned into it. I know, he said. That is the thing that he stopped, finding the right words. That is the thing that I did not know I was looking for. To be known that way. She turned her face slightly and pressed her lips to his palm. He made a quiet sound. She looked at him. Come inside, she said. I will make tea and you can tell me about the traitor and the court and what comes next, and we will figure out the rest of it. He came inside. She made tea. They sat at the table, the 2 cups between them, and he told her about the court and what had been found and what was now different. She listened with her full attention the way she always listened. She asked questions. He answered them completely. Outside the village went about its autumn morning. The herbs on the worktable caught the light. The fire did its quiet work. At some point during the 2nd cup, she reached across the table and he turned his hand and held hers, and they stayed that way while they talked, easy and natural, like this was something they had always done. She thought about the forest and the rain and the figure at the base of the oak tree and the decision she had made. She thought about 3 things packed in a basket and a practical woman who could not walk past something suffering. She thought about letters every 4 days and one true line at the end of each one. She thought about her grandmother saying, know what someone actually needs versus what they say they need. She looked at him across the table in her warm cottage with their hands together. She knew what she needed. She was looking at it.